perhaps. Okay, all right, thanks. So yeah, welcome everyone to this session. So this is a panel called Patterns and Peculiarities in Public Service Media. And the format of this is very sort of unusual and quite different to usual conference panels, in that this is a sort of collective project of 3 different people, and each of us is going to talk to our involvement in this project. But it's also more of a kind of, I think, a discussion, a kind of early discussion perhaps around some kind of methods and initial sort of things that we're trying out. So this isn't a sort of like final, sort of outcomes or anything of this research. It's very much the kind of research in progress. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort of quickly sort of introduce the topic, and then the 3 sort of members of this panel, the 3 collaborators, are going to then just talk in a bit more detail about their contribution. One of our presenters is currently sort of, I think, on a bus somewhere. He's here sort of watching, I think, but he's pre-recorded his section. That's Jannick. He's going to be second. There he is, he's waving on camera. But he's luckily pre-recorded his section, so he will, at some point, I will play that. But it will be Julia first, I'll introduce in a moment, then Jannick, and then myself. So this is a project that is a sort of policy. I say policy, but it's also just more broadly about public service values and things happening in broadcasting, scheduling, and so on, which Julia is going to talk about. But how we sort of think about and combine these with sort of data-driven approaches to television studies. So we're going to talk about each of our inputs into this, and there's sort of one of the outcomes or one of the outputs of this is a series of visualizations, and we circulated the link. Or LK circulated this yesterday, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. If not, don't worry, I think there'll be an opportunity just to kind of talk you through some of these things and some of these examples in a moment. But you can see here, this image here, this is one of the sort of main dashboards that we created just to kind of try to visualize some of the data that we've been working with. So just a bit about the sort of project overview and the sort of rationale of the project. So we have collectively, the 3 of us, myself, Julia and Jannick, have a shared interest, I think it's fair to say, in public service media. But more precisely, I think one of the things we're quite interested in is this idea or the kind of issue around public service media as it's adapting to platformization, for want of a better term. So, for example, there are a number of kind of questions involved in this. Some of them are embedded into the visualizations, which you might have seen. But we're interested in things such as, or kind of provocations such as, how do you maintain or measure public service values such as universalism in a context characterized by choice and personalization? So these are kind of features that we might associate quite a lot with an interface, and in some ways they maybe seem antithetical to existing public service values. And to what extent can we even quantify these kind of what are essentially quite abstract concepts such as universalism? So what we're talking about really here is this process of datafication and the datafication of public service media. And I think our sort of rationale and our sort of impetus for this research is captured quite nicely in this piece by Nikunen and Hocker, this recent piece from 2020, in which they say public service media and their values of universality, equality, diversity, and quality are affected by datafication and a platformed media environment. The embeddedness of public service media in a platformed media environment produces complex and contradictory dependencies between public service media and commercial platforms. The embeddedness has resulted in simultaneous processes of adapting to social media logics and datafication within public service media, as well as in attempts to create alternative public media value-driven data practices and new public media spaces. So in other words, this platformization of public service media involves 2 approaches. So on the one hand, there's an impulse to adapt and apply existing public service values within a new platform environment to essentially continue these long-standing legacy practices and values from broadcasting. On the other hand, these new platforms present new opportunities and incentives to rethink and reimagine public service media and practices. And our research is really an attempt to try to capture and document these 2 approaches. So we're interested in which broadcast or legacy practices have spilled over into the VOD space and which are unique to these platforms. So to that end, and hopefully this works, yeah. So our sort of project workflow is roughly this. So we sort of begin with Julia, which is why she's going to go first in a moment and talk about her involvement in this. And this sort of the point of scheduling and public service media values. So we're kind of starting at that level. Then it kind of passes on to Jannick, whose work and his kind of main involvement in this is the cleaning and collecting of data. And again, we'll see a recording of Jannick talking about some of the kind of key challenges in doing this. And then that data then sort of comes on into this third phase, which is where we start to analyze and visualize the data. And to be clear, because I'm not sure I've sort of mentioned it already, but what we're talking about here is kind of gathering data about VOD platforms and trying to kind of use that data to kind of explore these different approaches and these different strategies. So we might say then that we're moving from a slightly sort of qualitative position into a much more quantitative one. And in this image here, it's a kind of very linear process. But I think in reality, what we're talking about here is a kind of very cyclical process. So we do start with this, from this position of the qualitative research. So Julia's input in terms of scheduling, public service media values, then through to Jannick's work, then through to mine. But there is a relationship between all of these things. And for me, this is the kind of really challenging part. It's about combining the qualitative and the quantitative. And I think Julia might speak to this, but I certainly will talk a bit more about this in a moment when I talk about this third phase of or my involvement in the project. So it's these kind of connections between these various parts that's really challenging. I think independently we're able to do our own bits quite well, but it's about understanding how those pieces speak together. So that's all I want to say about the project for now. I think what I want to do at this stage is then just to stop my screen sharing and hand over to Julia. Just bear me 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing. I think that has stopped. So Julia, if you want to
yes. Hello everybody. And
screen share.
I will try.
Yeah, so Julia is at the University of Aarhus. I'll never know whether I pronounced that correctly. But yeah, if you want to introduce yourself and then just tell us a bit about your involvement in the project.
Yes, hello everybody. I hope that you can hear me. Oh no, I'm trying to do several things at one time. I'm trying to open my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, and it looks like I'm in my slide. So that's more advanced than I planned for. So maybe I will move around here. Okay, but yes, I'm a postdoc at Aarhus University in Denmark. I have been working most of my career with the qualitative part of studying public service television. I've been studying the development of the linear channel portfolio of the main broadcaster in public service broadcaster in Denmark, DR. So I bring a lot of insights into DR in our collaboration here, but of course the BBC is the mothership of all public service broadcasters and very clearly a mothership of DR. I will return to that later in the presentation. So our point of departure here. Basically, in this phase of our study of public service VOD services, we are interested in what content is delivered and how this is communicated. And as JP just said, our work is quantitative since we aim at making longitudinal studies to track the development over time. Jannick and JP both have collected data over quite some years now. So this can tell us which content is offered and how, but it cannot tell us why. And maybe that is where I come in with my curiosity. But for now, I will share some thoughts on that based in the theory. And then my approach to this work will also be conducting interviews in the industry. And I imagine that later today we can return to the discussion of the quantitative and qualitative approaches. But in my part of the presentation, I would like to go behind the data, so to speak, and touch upon the theoretical backdrop of our study and also develop on some of the key notions of the data set which has been shared with you. So our theoretical point of departure is within scheduling of television, and this is due to the fact that with Hanne Brun, we believe and argue that television is a cross-platform medium, and we believe that we can benefit from understanding concepts and principles from scheduling of linear channels, even though it is quite obvious that television is going through substantial changes. Ellis and Utreberg describe how the grid structure of the schedule and the profession as a scheduler developed in line with the increased channel offer and competition in the 1980s and 1990s. And Utreberg states that basically scheduling is a mark of a wish to maximize viewing. Thus, scheduling is more than just placing one program after another. It is a way to communicate to one's viewers, to stand out as something distinctive and attractive, and a means to attract and retain the viewer's attention. And familiar to many of us are concepts I have tried to illustrate here, such as tentpoling, hammocking, and stacking, principles developed by the commercial channels, but which has transferred to public service television. But what does television look like when it is in a streaming service? And with the words of James Bennett, instead of flow, here we have an interface, hyperlinks, and a database structure experienced via broadband rather than broadcasting. So, to what extent can we transfer the concepts of tentpoling and hammocking? Well, maybe not that much. Because one thing is for sure, we do need a new vocabulary. Now we talk about prime space instead of prime time, placement, discoverability, prioritization, prominence, curation, rows, decks, and tiles. When accessing a VOD interface, there's no doubt that placing of programs is perhaps even more important than it was in the market of linear channels. The choice is tremendous, and this goes for both the number of services and within the single VOD service, where an archive offers access to lots of programs at the same time. So, how to guide the user's attention in a VOD interface? Like the linear schedule must consider which channel at what time of the day and the order of programs, scheduling in a VOD interface must consider not just the placement in the interface, but also size of thumbnail picture, headline, how long a program should be visible and where it should be visible, as well as the labels used for its searchability. And this is just the choice of the first program. An informant in Danish public service television told me just last week that perhaps even more considerations go into which program to present as the second, that is, after the user has finished viewing of one program. To us as researchers, this means that we need to learn new ways of studying television. And this is what my two colleagues and I are trying to figure out how to do, because there are obstacles. Jannick and JP will go into details with which and how we deal with them, or at least with some of the obstacles and how we try to deal with them. One aspect we're interested in our research is genres and program types available in the VOD services. And this we find interesting in the light of the institutional perspective. We have chosen to study public service media, and this entails specific values and political regulation. We have institutions like the BBC and DR in our society because of a political wish and continued will to prioritize such institutions. However, this does not mean that the institutions can rest on the laurels. They must fight an ongoing battle to stay relevant to the population, but without being too popular and thus being accused of disturbing the market. At least that is the case in Denmark. Of course, there are many interpretations of what a public service medium is and should do. And one thing is what we find on paper, so to speak, in the political regulation and in the organizational settings. Another thing is the values which are related to the notion of public service media. Again, these values vary, but often we talk about versatility, diversity, impartiality, content of a certain quality, catering to minorities, including children and young people, supporting the national language, culture and identity, economically and politically independent institutions, content which support democracy and debate in society, and universalism. And of these values, I would like to dive into diversity and universalism, since these are two parameters that we're trying to operationalize, as JP mentioned before. So, as stated by McQuail, on its own, diversity of supply cannot secure diversity of reception, but it is a necessary condition for this. And back in 1989, Patty Scannell famously argued for the supply of mixed program services to support democratization of society. Segmenting the viewers into niche channels with segmented content or target groups would undermine shared common knowledge, experiences, and dialogue, Scannell argued. Because one cannot assume that viewers will seek out a diverse program supply themselves. Now we are past the segmented channel portfolios and we have personalized VOD services where users can not only pick and choose programs and binge episodes, but also are offered content based on collaborative filtering. But still, an important aspect of the public service media organization's raison d'etre is the diverse and versatile program offer. So we ask, how is this obligation being met in the streaming services? In a few minutes, JP will take you through how such a study could be operationalized. And the other value I would like to touch upon is universalism. Earlier, universalism was simply a question of access. Who could receive the broadcast signal, as you can see here behind me? The public service broadcasters were given the task to provide content for the entire nation, not just the large cities. But with digital services, universalism is now related to other concerns. Jakubovic and van den Bulk and Moore argue that universalism should be interpreted as not just a question of access, but also a question of content. Content with mass appeal and content for the users outside the mainstream audience. And it should be no secret that we, JP, Jannick, and I, are struggling with how to measure universalism. Is it at all possible? How to understand universalism in a digital context, and how to decide and count which programs are for the mainstream audience and which programs are for the niche or targeted, segmented target groups. A famous Danish example is the program Married at First Sight, which was originally a niche program found on the Experimenting Youth channel, but it grew huge in popularity both within and outside the Danish borders. Once again, I can say that my colleague JP will take you through a suggestion for how to measure universalism, and we will be quite happy to discuss this with you afterwards. So moving from the more general perspective to the specific, I would like to touch upon the two streaming services we have chosen to study, the iPlayer and DRTV. In comparing the two services, we find some similarities. The institutions behind the services have been founded nearly at the same time, and in Denmark, the BBC clearly has been the mothership, as I mentioned earlier. Everything the BBC did DR would do a couple of years later. At least this was how it was done until last year, but that is another story. And I can only recommend and encourage you to read the CST blog post by JP and myself. Oh, and now you can see that I'm in Denmark here. If we look at the respective market sizes of BBC and DR, we find very different players. The BBC has a potential market size of 28.1 million households, while DR in Denmark only has a potential audience of 2.7 million households. Comparing the two services is interesting because what the BBC has in size, DR has in digital innovation. In the fall of 2021, DR launched a new strategy that would put digital first. This meant that the streaming service DRTV is to become the main entrance or the front door to all of DR's content, and that DR wishes to produce content that fits the digital format. So it means digital in both the production format, in the communication of the programs, and in accessing the content. If we compare the services of the BBC and DR, we find that they go about the job of creating a VOD service in quite different ways. As described by JP and Jannick in the 2021 article, the iPlayer can be seen as a small boutique, offering smaller, more curated choice, while DRTV is more like a large supermarket with plenty of items on the shelves, many rows with goods, and some special offers to be found more than one place in the shop or interface. Thus, we have two aims with our work. First, we are simply interested in studying how legacy public service media adapt to a digital and more data-driven reality. And second, we wish to test and discuss methods to use for the study of digital television. And finally, before I pass on the torch to my colleagues, I wish to address one challenge for the study of the streaming services. And that is, of course, personalization. And as I write here on the slide, we have more to come. That is more personalization to come. DR is in the middle of testing more personalized versions of DRTV, because in their perspective, this is the only right answer to the increasing competition, which causes DR and DRTV to lose viewers. And I think it's not difficult to come up with arguments that goes against this view of more personalization. One can ask, what about the common knowledge, experiences, and debate in society, for instance? In interviews, I hear that staff in DR put a lot of considerations into the balance between curated content and personalized offers. Right now, not many Danes log in. Oh, the red button there. Not many Danes log into the service, but most Danes reject the cookies. So this makes life really hard for DR when wanting to offer personalized content. And also the BBC believes that user data can make the service more relevant and valuable, and is working on a project which offers personal data storage. However, personalization will make our job as researchers more difficult. Regarding DRTV, it might be as soon as next spring we will face new challenges in how to collect data and how to measure and analyze. But that will be another story when this is implemented. For now, I will let Jannick and JP take over with more detailed insights into and discussions of how to study public service streaming services. And afterwards, I will be more than happy to take part in a discussion.
Thank you so much, Julia. So we do, as I said, the format is unusual for this. So we will go to Jannick in a moment, but there is at least one question in the chat, Julia, that you might want to respond to at this stage, perhaps. From Christine.
Yes, let me find the chat.
I can read the question out for you. So it says, you use TV theory, which was written before the digital revolution. Do you still find it relevant?
Well, that has been a discussion amongst JP, Jannick, and I, and we have tried to sort of translate some of the old notions and ideas from the scheduling theory. So to quite some extent, I think that we can benefit from the linear television theories. But I conducted an interview with one of the schedulers in DR just last week, and I asked about some of these notions like tent polling and hammocking, and he was like, no, we cannot use it anymore. It's completely a new way. We need to think completely new ways to go about the scheduling. So I think it's up for discussion if we can use this the theory.
Cool, thanks. There is another question in there, but it's more of a sort of general one that I think maybe we'll come back to at the end, which is kind of about the project as a whole and the sort of how would you sort of say the kind of various bits of labour involved in it, let's say. So maybe we'll come back to that one. Jannick, who I think is still here, if you are here, Jannick, I've got your contribution recorded. So just to let everyone know, Jannick's unable to kind of present his thing live. So he's luckily for us pre-recorded it, which I'm going to share live from my screen. But did you want to just briefly introduce yourself or say anything before I play your part?
Yes, it was a funny coincidence that JP and I met at a conference many years ago and realized we are doing exactly the same thing, but with two different broadcasters. So that started the research interest, and then I met Julia. I think still, I mean, we are very much in the pioneer state of this kind of research, and so are the broadcasters, because when I talk to DR, they are not really sure how to use the software they have bought. So they are still trying to figure out with that. But unfortunately, I have to leave the conversation now, but I will try to join when I'm able to, and then save the questions for my presentation for the very end.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks so much, Jannick.
So bye-bye.
All right, thanks for making the effort to join us. So I do, as I said, I've got the Jannick's recording. I'm just going to share my screen, making sure to turn sound on, and then I'm going to choose this screen. So I think that should be showing now. So this is Jannick's little contribution, and I'm just going to hit play. If somebody could just let me know if there are any problems in the chat, but hopefully you should be able to hear this loud and clear. You're not hearing anything.
It's very quiet.
It's very quiet, is it? That's strange. It was working perfectly before. Let me try muting myself and then playing it again and seeing if that works. Otherwise, I do have a link to it on Dropbox. So I'm going to mute myself, play it.
Have you shared your sound?
I have shared my sound. Yeah. I'll switch it off and try again. Let me just stop sharing, and then I'll try it again. So include computer sound. It's strange because this did work before perfectly well.
It worked beautifully earlier.
Yeah. Okay, so let me know if this is any better.
Cleaning video on demand.
Okay.
Welcome to my presentation. I'm Jannick Kirk Sorensen, Associate Professor at Aalborg University, Copenhagen, Denmark. My presentation here will focus on the challenges of collecting and cleaning video on demand data. And the case I will be working with is the Danish broadcasting DR and their video on demand service DRTV. This is how it looked like recently. And I have been collecting over the last couple of years every day a snapshot of what is shown in the interface. Here you see the interface has different lengths as you go on over time. In what we analyze here is 520 days from November 19 to May 2020. The great project, or the grand general project, is to make the latent or the hidden data visible, to look for possible patterns in the video on demand publication strategy and to characterize it. So you could also say it's a distant reading. And this presentation will focus on the methodological challenges when analyzing and also when collecting the video on demand data. First, we come from a tradition of linear TV, and in the documenting and analyzing the linear schedule, there are not so many parameters to take into account. You have the channel, you have the broadcasting time, you have the program title, and if it's part of a series, and then finally the source of information. Is it the printed schedule, or is it the actually broadcasted schedule? While video on demand offers quite many more methodological challenges already when collecting the data. So which pages should we collect? The front page or all the sub pages? When should we collect? How often should we collect? Once a day or every hour? What do we do with the program titles? Because, for instance, we will find out that the news, there's something called the evening news every day. So, but it's although it's the same title, it has new content. So we should be careful not counting this as only one. Then the content is presented in bands or collections. So should we also analyze the titles of these collections? You could say the heading of a bunch of videos, and also the position of this band on the page and the position of the video in each band. Then we could look at the visual design, the user experience design. So how are pictures emphasized with backgrounds, the size, the format, all these parameters. Then which device do we look from use as a basis for analysis? The video on demand, this might be displayed differently on a laptop compared to a smartphone or to an iPad or a smart TV. And even on a laptop, it may look different in different browsers. Then the question is, where are we located when collecting? Because because the video content is typically copyrighted, and thus it may be subject to geo-blocking. Then what is written here with capital letters, personalization. We don't look into that in this presentation, but obviously it's a challenge how to compare the personalization different people get. And finally, on which scale should we make the comparisons, day to day or week to week? Well, you could, for the last one, you could say you have also that challenge for the linear schedule. Now, well, if we want to characterize the video on demand offer, we could look at the case of culture in the Danish Broadcasting Corporation. It comes as trivial that culture programming is a classical, typical obligation for public service broadcasters. In 2019, DR published a new strategy with a core proposition, value over volume. This was triggered by you could say, intense political climate against DR, where they were kind of forced to have a less dominant position in Denmark, or to do something to have a less dominant position. So media politicians pointed out 3 areas of content, also acknowledged by DR, namely news, culture, and content for children and young people, as the prioritization areas for DR. So Now let's analyze the culture contents. So just a brainstorm, what could we be looking at here? The amount of content, the number of distinct titles, where are they positioned at the page, how many days are they available? These were just some ideas, but the question is, what is culture? How do we find it? Now we are confronted with the path dependency of linear TV, because linear TV is, as in many countries, described on radio in public service audit reports, the public service value submitted to the media board yearly. So for DR and for Danish public service TV, we have 9 different categories, as you see to the left. And enlightenment and culture, that is one of them, oplysning og kultur in Danish. But this is the linear TV. On the video on demand interface, we don't find this, but if we identify, and I have done so, identify the programs from the linear TV schedule in the on-demand schedule or in the on-demand interface, we will see that these programs also appear. But the video on demand interface from DRTV does not have anything called enlightenment and culture. They have culture and then a number of other so-called display categories. These are the genre written with small letters under each title, program title in the interface. And one could now ask, how well do they overlap or match? And I have made a visualization here. On the horizontal axis, we see the public service audit categories, and you can see in the middle we see actually oplysning and kultur, enlightenment and culture. And on the vertical axis, we see the display categories as they are shown in the interface. There are quite many, actually, more than I just showed. So here we have the culture category from the interface, and here we see how it maps to the different public service audit categories. So the biggest share of programs, they falls into this oplysning and kultur, enlightenment and culture, but we also have somebody that are when reported to the public service audit, they are characterized as current affairs and debate, or as music, or a single one which is foreign drama and fiction, and 3 ones which are entertainment. So already now we feel that it's getting slippery, this culture concept, at least when we want to count it. And that is what I have done in the following slides. The top visualization shows 520 days of the presence of all content that is labeled with the enlightenment and culture category from the public service audit reports. So it's really, there's a lot of content we could see here. Actually, not most of the content, but a very big share of it. And we see there are 2,265 different unique titles within this category. In the middle plot, we see what are the programs that are labeled kultur, and there's only 149 distinct programs. Finally, there is a third way to identify the programming. That is this dedicated cultural page from DRTV. And if we use that as a definition for what is culture and map it to the front page, which is what we are analyzing in this presentation, we will see we get 282 different programs, distinct programs, and they are a little bit more. There's a little bit more density than in the middle when only looking at culture. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that a program can have more than one display label. So you could have a program that is having a display label music, and it's displayed as that in the front page, but it still also have the display label culture. And here we see the mapping of this. So there are 90 of these programs that are only having culture label, but we have a number of programs that have more than one label, you can see here. That is the blue pie chart. The green pie chart shows us that from the programs that are identified as culture, because they had this label in the display in the front page, we will see that 104 of them, they are enlightenment and culture, but also 18 are current affairs and debate, and 23 is music. So it gets slippery to try to say something about the culture in DR. And the problem started actually even before, because already this problem occurs when I'm cleaning the data and when I'm entering into the database. So, for instance, how should I deal with multiple display genres for the same content? It was just by coincidence, or rather through an interview with staff from DR, that I was told that content can have more than one display category. So then I ran the whole script once again to catch all these different display categories. But again, which of them are the authoritative? And then we also discovered that there are a few programs that have more than one public service audit category. So how should we deal with that? And then, as I just discussed, there are inconsistencies between the display category labels and the public service category labels. And finally, there's a trivial job, but quite a big job to merge titles that are maybe the same. There could be a typo. It could be a hyphen that is different. Is it the same program or is it another? So summarizing, counting is easy, but our work here has shown that there are some quite deep methodological problems in just characterizing the video on demand, and they are located first in the cleaning of the data, could even say also in collecting the data, and then in the categorizing of the data, and finally in the visualization of the data. There is, you could say, there's a lot of work to be done before we are ready with a more consistent, valid method for characterizing video on demand services. That was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will get back to me with questions. I hope I can be present here online or in a chat. Welcome to my presentation. I'm Jannick Kirk Sorensen, associate.
Okay, I think once is enough. As interesting as that was, we'll leave that there for now. So it's really helpful though, because Jannick's kind of work finishes on a note that segues into what I now want to just talk about, and that is that sort of third stage. Obviously, there's a bit of overlap between each of these stages. In particular, for instance, I'm involved as well a lot in the sort of the data collection process, and so all of these things Jannick has talked about are kind of things that cause me headaches as well. But I just want to sort of, I don't want to spend too long on this, because I'd like to try and sort of have a little time, if we can, for people to ask questions, maybe to kind of look at and talk a bit about the visualizations themselves. But I do just want to kind of talk briefly about a few of what I see as the key challenges involved in this third stage. So this is the stage of analysis and visualization. So it overlaps, as I said, with what Jannick was talking about, but there's a few more kind of specific and distinct challenges and issues that I think are worth just kind of highlighting here. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the challenges here, but then I will also share a few of the insights and sort of take up, excuse me, the challenge, I think, of what Julia was saying about trying to think of ways we might, for instance, measure or visualize things like universalism, these kind of public service values. Before I get into these challenges, I want to say something a bit sort of broadly, I guess, about data visualization as a critical tool or method. So I would argue that it's an increasingly important tool, and partly because the amount of data is now being generated at an unprecedented rate. Not only this, but it's integral to the industry. It's integral to the kinds of platforms that we're looking at. So these things can't function without it. And actually, it's significantly, it's used within the industry. It's used within organizations such as the BBC, such as Netflix, and so on, to make various kinds of decisions and derive various kinds of insights, whether that's about commissioning or just the kind of general stability of a platform or service. So data emerges, then the sort of volume of it is so kind of significant that we need to kind of develop ways, I think, to kind of understand that data and to kind of engage with it and to kind of derive some value and insight from it. So data visualization as a critical tool emerges as a kind of not just as something that's useful, but for me, I think that's something that's clearly a necessity to simplify, to make sense of, and to characterize this data and their usage. And as I said, this is obviously already happening within the industry itself. For instance, at the BBC, lots of people are kind of trained up and kind of given sort of briefings on data visualization and how to kind of utilize this with various data they might be working with. But I think we need to also kind of extend this and sort of incorporate these practices within academia. So data visualization as well, I should add, for me, isn't something sort of that should be conceived of to be used independently or discretely. I think of it as more one component within a qualitative / quantitative workflow, and it should work in tandem with these other methods. So it's not something that should replace these things. And for me, as I said before, the key challenge is trying to figure out how you connect up this this kind of work with the more qualitative stuff. And as useful as it is, I think we also need to be aware of some of the kind of limitations of these tools that we're using, some of the kind of biases that are perhaps sort of embedded within their design. So this is the kind of idea of tool criticism that people such as Karen Van Ness and others have kind of talked about, that we just need to be careful with not just sort of taking these programming languages or these visualization tools and just using them without actually kind of really considering their differences. So there are different languages. Jannick, for example, uses Python a lot, whereas I use R, and these languages are kind of set up for quite sort of different, or they kind of they work better for different things essentially. But then within them, there are certain kinds of biases, and inevitably you could argue different sorts of insights and outcomes from using these different languages. The same will go for visualization tools. So I use Tableau, but there are other tools on the market, Microsoft Power BI, for instance. But the point is that we need to kind of just be aware of these tools and think about what these tools can or can't do. So in this final stage of visualization, these are things I think we need to be aware of. But as I said, the kind of key thing that sort of troubles me a lot, I think, is trying to figure out how do we combine quantitative and qualitative methods. And this recent tweet sort of tickled me when I saw it, because I was in the sort of throes of working on this this presentation. So a petition to replace quantitative and qualitative with numbery and feely. So really it's a question of how do we combine these? How do we combine the numbery and the feely? And I will kind of come back to this in a moment, and hopefully we'll kind of get a bit more into this in the discussion. But I just want to sort of flag this up as something that's very much on my mind. I'm sort of trying to avoid making this too sort of numerical, too numbery, essentially. So my approach, I guess, or the kind of approaches that exist within analysis and visualization is to, on the one hand, kind of take quite a sort of broad view through this kind of lens of what we would call dashboards, or slightly more kind of narrow focus and more refined visualizations, which are just for the purposes of alliteration I've called deep dives. These are just terms that I've purely invented. But within data science and data visualization, there are sort of broadly two distinct approaches or kind of schools. So first of all, you have what's called exploratory data analysis. So for instance, John Tukey, he kind of conceived of this, as you can see, in the late 1970s. as a sort of a theoretical model of analysis. So you don't approach the data with any sort of particular hypothesis in mind, but you sort of, it's more about letting the data speak for itself and kind of show its, kind of reveal itself to you, reveal its kind of interesting patterns or peculiarities. So in this sense, it's also, I think, quite a useful method to perhaps break up what Stefan Bach has called interpretive monopolies. So this is the idea of, you know, organizations such as, say, the BBC or Netflix, who have these huge data sets, but they will sort of visualize them and analyze them and then present us the final findings. So we have no sort of involvement in that process. We don't have access to the raw data. And the sort of issue with that, as Bach argues, is that sometimes we might end up with simply a kind of version of the data or a kind of narrative that just sort of reinforces the sort of agenda or the bias of the institution itself. So this is where exploratory data analysis can be useful, and I've tried to do this through the dashboard. These are the kind of broad overviews that try to give you a kind of really distant view or distant reading of the data, and in this instance, BBC iPlayer. The other approach, and it's kind of essentially the opposite in many ways, is confirmatory data analysis, or CDA. So this is where you use it as a method to test hypotheses. So you have a kind of, you kind of approach the material or the data with a kind of hypothesis in mind, and then you use that to sort of try to support that. And obviously there are some slight problems with that, but we'll come on to that in a moment. But this is where you can then perhaps use it for, it's more relevant, let's say, to the deep dives. So the more focused visualizations that present findings, arguments, and potentially prove these hypotheses. But it's also worth just kind of saying at this point as well that these models are not mutually exclusive, and that actually in practice and in data science and data visualization, there's a kind of usually a movement between the two. You might sometimes begin a project or kind of start with a data set and approach it in this very broad exploratory way, or you might do the opposite. But the idea is that you sort of move between them, and that one might kind of provide a kind of pathway to the other. So those are the sort of two broad approaches, but in sort of taking any of these approaches, we come across some kind of quite general challenges. And the first of which, and I think maybe the most significant of which, is this, it kind of goes back to this question of the kind of quantitative, I suppose, and it's this notion of abstraction. And this is particularly the case with exploratory data analysis, I think, in dashboards, because there is such a kind of distant view involved. So with these dashboards, which you may have already seen in the link that was circulated yesterday, we run a risk of abstraction where the view becomes too distant, it becomes too abstract essentially, and it renders the data incoherent. And the focus is then too much on the quantitative and potentially loses sight of the qualitative. And a second and related issue is that of false correlations. So if the reading is too distant, if the filters and parameters are too flexible, it becomes possible then to find patterns in the data that suit our existing hypotheses or even our existing biases, even if we're not aware of those. As Boyd and Crawford note, this phenomenon of what they call apophenia, seeing patterns where none exists, becomes more problematic the more data you have, because it can essentially be sort of manipulated at will. And there's a rather whimsical example, which you can see here in this image, where there's this very strong correlation between the number of people who drowned falling into a pool and the number of films in which Nicolas Cage has appeared. So this is from a website called Spurious Correlations, if you want to go and find some other funny examples. But the point is if you have enough data, you can start to kind of create these correlations or find kind of matches and patterns that need further interrogation. And I think this is where we then need to move back into the kind of qualitative terrain, where we have to kind of use our other critical methods and tools to try to sort of understand these patterns better. So finally, one last challenge, one last thing I just want to mention here, which is the sort of process of visualization itself. And there is essentially a seemingly endless array of ways to visualize the data. And there are some best practices and kind of recommendations which help us narrow down effective approaches, such as the list which you can see here, which shows us what are called pre-attentive attributes. But even so, the range of possibilities is still overwhelming. And maybe if you have looked at the series of visualizations already, you might get a sense of that. I've sort of essentially made a whole bunch of different ways to kind of look at the data, and each I think is quite sort of radically different and shows us quite different things. And in this sense, then, I think exploratory data analysis is somewhat of a fallacy, or it kind of highlights some of the problems of it, because it's impossible to explore the data objectively. We must always choose how to view and visualize the data, what parameters and filters to apply in the first place, and so on. So that's it. As I said, I just wanted to do a very kind of quick sort of I suppose, run through of some of the kind of key challenges. I don't think it's necessary to go into too much detail, but at this stage, I'm going to now sort of try and switch over to the visualization itself and just talk through a couple of insights, a couple of patterns and peculiarities within the visualizations that we've made. So this is where I sort of attempt to sort of respond to the challenge that Julia set, which is the trying to sort of demonstrate, I suppose, some kind of public service value concepts, or think about how we might measure those. So hopefully you can all see this. I'm just going to full screen this visualization. Let me just bring up the chat here just to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, so this is, again, maybe some of you have already been and seen these visualizations, but if not, this is what it looks like. The navigation, I think, is quite simple. So you just got all these tabs across the top and you sort of make your way through them essentially. So the first section is just the kind of welcome section, a bit about our project. There are some questions and exercises if you are interested in doing those. Maybe you've had a go at those already. There's also just a kind of brief explanation of how the interface is structured and how I've sort of tried to translate this into the visualization. So one of the key components is, you can see here, the iPlayer interface heat map, which is based on that kind of grid structure that the iPlayer uses. So the sort of first, this is where we get into the sort of broad, very distant reading. Oh, I'm going to do some weird stuff here. Let's hope that's not going to cause any problems. So this is an example of a dashboard of this kind of very broad overview. And this is the kind of thing that is used quite a lot in industry, and not just in the creative industries, but in all kinds of industries, to give people an overview of kind of real-time data quite often and kind of key analytics and so on. So what I've done here is I've got the dashboard, and each of these different visualizations is all connected. So as soon as you interact with one, all of the others update. So this is the heat map of the iPlayer. This is the just color coded. The darker the color, the more number of titles have appeared in that row or that slot, that box. Here we have the channel. So it shows you how many of these were, for example, in BBC One. So immediately, without even clicking or doing anything, without changing any parameters or filters, we can see the content tagged or attributed to BBC One is the most popular in the interface. And I think that in itself is kind of quite a valuable insight. And then BBC Two, BBC Three, and so on. We can also see here the share of channel over time. So one of the things I set or suggested in the questions or activities was to try to find the most popular day of the year for BBC One, where its share peaked. So maybe you've done this already, but as you can see here, it was the 25th of December 2021. So this is quite interesting. It's Christmas Day. And I think that, again, could be a sort of interesting sort of insight to take back into the kind of qualitative sort of debates and discussions. So why is it that BBC One is most popular on that day? Is it because there's something about that sort of universal kind of experience, or the kind of sense of a kind of collective shared experience of consuming television? We can also see that that does not, it's not the case always. So BBC One goes through periods where it doesn't have a significant share. Here it's only just over 32% share of the interface, whereas it was almost 70% on Christmas Day. So literally was 67%. There we go. So quite a significant difference there. Then all the other visualizations, I don't need to go into them, but this will shows you the breakdown of genre, breakdown of categories, and even by day of the week and by month, how much content we can see here. So immediately you can also probably notice that there is this kind of strange anomaly here. So this is where we get into the kind of patterns and peculiarities, outliers, and kind of patterns within the data. So if we click on that, as I said, it should render my, obviously I'm running like Teams and PowerPoint and Tableau, so it might take a moment for these things to work. But as soon as we click that, we can see that BBC One is no longer the most popular. In fact, now BBC Two is very popular in this row, but we can also see the share over time. There's some odd things kind of happening here, which maybe explains why there are fewer titles appearing. So there are some kind of like blackouts, especially around this period and a couple later on. And also what seems to be a complete sort of shift in the kind of colors here. So no longer are we talking about BBC Two as the brand it's attributed, but what we can see is BBC Sport suddenly becomes popular at this moment in time. And then we can look at the dates. That's early February that starts to happen. And so I did this and I was like, well, what was going on at this point in time? And this was the Winter Olympics, I think it was. So we can see that this row then sort of shifts, and it sort of has fewer titles, I think bigger titles it had at this point, directing people to that. So maybe that's not a kind of hugely fascinating insight. I don't know, maybe it is. But I think it says something about the way that the interface is kind of responds to kind of what's going on at this time. It's kind of trying to kind of show and display content that's relevant to whether it's sports or current affairs or whatnot. So let me undo that and reset that visualization. So that's just there's all these filters here you can do various stuff with, and you're welcome to kind of go away and play with this later on. But I just want to say a couple of very quick things about diversity and then universalism before I then just sort of return and let people ask questions. So we did have this kind of thought, I suppose this is a confirmatory data analysis, where we suspected, I suppose, that maybe for the interface to kind of promote diversity of content, say in the way that a broadcast schedule might kind of try to have a mix of programs for people, one thing it might do is it might sort of try to prioritize a mix of programs higher up the interface where there is that prime space. And that is what happens, what we can see here. So this visualization on the left here shows the sort of mix of genres, essentially, average mix of genres per row over the entire sort of 8-month sample of data that we used for this. So we can see the average mix for the top row is 7.6. It is much lower in the second row, but there's a kind of key caveat here, because a lot of this content isn't labeled with a genre. So for some reason, they don't add genre labels very frequently or very often in the second row. If they did, this figure would be significantly higher. And what I think we can see is a general pattern of a quite sort of intense amount of mix of genres, let's say high up, until it sort of, as you move down, it becomes slightly sort of more evenly balanced, let's say, in fewer genres. And you even get ones like the bottom couple of rows here, where there is a kind of handful of genres here, but then a kind of real sort of intense small number of genres that kind of comprise the rest of it. So in the sense, this might be one way we could think about diversity. And I recognize that genre isn't necessarily the best way to kind of measure this, but I think it's one way that we could sort of try to get a sense of it. In terms of universalism, which Julia sort of in her presentation suggested I might respond to. So this is my attempt to kind of think about how we could do that. I did that in a couple of ways. One was to think about the sort of sequence, the kind of sameness. So instead of difference, thinking about sameness and content that's perhaps most commonly encountered or most commonly viewed. So there's two ways you can do that. One is thinking about it in terms of the combination of genres. So you can see the most common sequences just in those first 4 columns, which are the 4 that are visible when you land on the iPlayer. The 5 most common combinations are all identical combinations. So film times 4, comedy times 4, drama times 4, and so on. So you can see there is a kind of interesting sort of emphasis on the sameness of genres there. But another way to look at that is sort of prominence. So I've created this metric, this prominence metric, which is based on the number of times a title appears in the interface and also where it appears within the interface, to get a sense of its frequency and its kind of prominence in terms of positioning. So we then get a sense of what are the most prominent programs. So just highlighting the top 30 here, because the number of titles is quite extensive. We can see Peaky Blinders, EastEnders, Pretty Little Liars, and so on. There is some analysis and description on here, but I don't want to sort of go into that because I'm conscious of time, and perhaps it might be better just to kind of return and go over to Julia in a moment to get her thoughts, and I think on what she maybe thinks could be valuable to kind of take out from these visualizations. Before I go over to Julia, there's one sort of final thing I wanted to say, which was that data visualization, as I kind of talked about here, I've talked about very much in terms of this very sort of distant reading of television, and it seems to fit quite nicely with the sort of data we're working with, which is this longitudinal interface data. But I think there's also kind of potential to apply it to kind of the text themselves, television programs themselves, for instance. So where we might be able to then move from distant to close or slightly closer readings. And just to draw your attention to this one example of how we could do this. So this is from a post, I can't remember when this was, maybe about 3 years ago or so. I wrote for Critical Studies in Television, where I essentially took just one episode of House of Cards and I broke it up into the different scenes. So the scenes are color coded, but also shot length, so you can see the almost like a kind of pulse of the program. So you can get this kind of quick overview, but then maybe it sort of directs you into interesting moments. So the kind of peaks or the troughs are maybe one way to kind of invite us in or kind of offer some sort of kind of closer sense of the text. So what I'm going to do at this stage is I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to. So I realised that my Tableau was hiding that slide. So let me just go back to that slide very briefly. So that was the House of Cards thing that I did. So you can see the little kind of graph and the little visualization there. But I'm going to now hand back over to Julia, who maybe if you want to just respond to. Hopefully you find some of the visualizations useful, let's say, to kind of feed back into that first stage again. So were any of those things useful? And I'm also, just for everyone else here, just leaving up these general prompts and questions, which maybe once Julia's spoken to that, maybe we can sort of open up for discussion and questions at that point.
Yes, thank you for letting me have the ball once again. I would also like to refer to a question Jannick asked in his presentation, because he asked if we should analyze the heading and position of the programs. And I believe that the answer is a very clear and strong yes. And that is because I find it valuable to combine the quantitative and the qualitative. And for me, when we collaborate and you provide us with this very nice overview, I see that, of course, I mean, you put way more work into that in just creating an overview, but I think it's necessary to try to answer the why is it like that, as I mentioned in my presentation. So why do they communicate television in the way they do? And I very much like your example with Christmas Day and the BBC One, that is Christmas Day. We find that BBC One takes up a lot of space in the interface. And I think that, of course, we can ask them, why do you do that? I'm not sure that they always can answer that clear. I asked in DR, so what are your thoughts about having more live channels up close to the top of the page? And the answer was like, oh well, it seems to work. And I had all this theory of liveness in my head, but it was like, well, it's working. So maybe we can't get the answers that would fit with our theory from the industry, but I think that the knowledge of where we came from, the knowledge of the linear channels, of scheduling, of what the institutions, which obligations the institutions have, I think that can help us tremendously in interpreting the quantitative data and help us finding meaning in all these numbers and in this overview and visualization, because right now it's beautiful colors, it's lots of data, but to dive more into it, to understand it, I think it's important to have the background knowledge of the institutions, of what we come from historically, an understanding of the television medium.
Cool, thank you so much. Yeah, so I completely agree with that, and I'm glad that you found it useful, considering how long it takes to make these things. That's one reason I'm glad you found it useful. So I think at this stage, what I would suggest we do, we've got sort of like roughly 15 minutes. I mean, I could waffle on for 15 minutes more, but I think it would be nice to try to kind of get people involved a little bit here. So we do have a series of kind of questions or prompts here, which I think most of which were in the visualization itself, so maybe you've seen these already. So I'd sort of put these to the audience, but also invite other general questions. There was another kind of question earlier, so we could sort of speak to that perhaps in a moment. But the kind of key things that I'd be interested to kind of hear other people's thoughts on are, for example, whether they were able to discover any patterns within the data, if they were able to have a go at using the visualizations, what maybe they tell us about exposure via VOD interfaces and the experience of online consumption. Conversely, can we identify any broadcasting corollaries, such as specific scheduling techniques within the data? Are there publishing strategies or patterns within the data that don't have a broadcast equivalent? Then there's a kind of question that I think speaks to that sort of EDA, CDA sort of divide. Should we use these kinds of data to confirm our existing hypotheses, or should we use the data to generate new research questions? Is there perhaps a middle ground? What other data could we use or create? I'd be interested if people have interesting data sets, for example, that you could sort of do this stuff with, because I think there's a kind of huge potential there. What methods or approaches could we apply? And to what extent can we even quantify these kind of abstract qualitative concepts such as universalism, diversity, pluralism, etc.? I know we've sort of, myself, Jannick and Julia, have been having these sort of heated discussions via email about whether you can quantify something like universalism. And for the record, Jannick has convinced you absolutely cannot. I think I'm more sort of open to the idea that you could at least do something to kind of get some of an insight into it, that you know, using these kinds of techniques and methods. So I mean, people can either just type questions into the chat, which I can see is already happening, or you're welcome to jump on microphone/camera and ask questions. But we have one from Elke, which is, do you find patterns of paternalism as well in the data? Do we? Have we found that yet? Julia?
Well, it depends on how to understand this, because I think, well, my answer to that question would be, from my perspective, it would be a clear sense of public service obligations, in the sense that on DRTV this winter, spring, when the war in Ukraine started, DR decided to move the live channels up close to the top of the page and launch a new news live update channel. So in this way, to make the news offer more discoverable, instead of being hidden in row number 5, for instance. And that would be, well, you could say that that is paternalism, because that is a way of trying to push the news consumption to the users, instead of watching yet another episode of Married at First Sight US. So in that way, the answer could be yes, but we could also turn it around and saying it's a way to stand apart from other VOD services.
Yeah, I think if I may come in there, the reason I asked this question is because I've spoken to quite a few people recently in Wales for BBC Wales, and we were talking about multi-platform. So it was all about similar kind of questions, no public service and multi-platform and all of these things. But the thing that really struck me was that people were very, very strongly taking a quite paternalistic stance in those conversations, including in saying things like, well, sometimes the people don't know what they want or what they need, you know, which obviously from our point of view made my skin crawl maybe a little bit. But it also strikes me right now, you know, on the iPlayer, if you go onto the iPlayer right now, obviously, you know, the Boris Johnson thing is quite prominent, but it's not the most prominent either, which also indicates something around curation potentially. So quite worthwhile. Yes, yeah, so for me, this is just something that's still very strongly in my mind as well. How can you investigate that as well just through the data, or do you have to speak to people? Do you need that qualitative data to make it more holistic in a way?
Yeah, I would say you need to do both those things, because it is still the question of how, like, the data is so kind of fixed there, and there are certain categories and only certain amounts of things you can get. So and you have to then sort of get a bit creative with it and think about what could we do with that to try to get slightly nearer to that topic or that issue. So as you know, I showed earlier, that kind of those approaches of thinking about diversity or universalism. In the case of diversity, all we can really go on is, for example, the mix of genres. We don't really know much. The data itself doesn't have anything within it about diversity within the program itself, for example. And so that's where an example of much more qualitative research you would need to undertake. So yeah, so I absolutely, I think what I was trying to get at in my sort of part of the presentation was that problem of abstraction and the kind of being too distant and losing sight of it. I think this for me is an interesting tool to kind of maybe direct our attention towards there's some interesting thing happening here. And it's also, I think, a necessity as well, because it is such a kind of big amount of data that's kind of being constantly generated in a kind of, you know, a longitudinal experience too, that it's the only way to kind of try to make sense of it. So you have to kind of do the quantitative and also the qualitative together, I think, in order to get that, like I say, holistic.
If I can just shortly reply, because I can see we have more questions. 80% of people visiting DRTV know what they come for. So there's the users don't know what they want. That's simply not true in the case of DRTV. So that is why it's the second program choice that's so important. And that's way trickier to measure, because that goes into, so do you want to binge the next episode of what you're watching, or which offer do you get? And that's, I don't know, that's over to Jannick and JP. Can we in any way measure that? I think that's a completely other story. But yeah, maybe JP, you would like to answer Kathy's?
Yeah, so what we could invite Kathy, if Kathy's willing to come on the camera, microphone, yeah, she can.
Yeah, I can do that. And actually, just to pick up on what Julia just said, in the research that we've done, the qual and the quant research, we found our participants primarily know what they want before they watch on demand anyway. Actually, before they, most of the time before they turn on the telly, people know what they want to watch. So I think a lot of our sort of emphasis on discoverability in platforms is important, but we also need to recognise that it's not necessarily at that sort of first moment, and there's all the stuff outside it. So I had a few questions, so it's so interesting. JP, you went through it quite quickly, so I might have read this, apologies, but it felt to me like the sort of diversity data was almost kind of measuring the opposite of the universality data. And I wonder how, if that is the case, how do we make sense of that in the context of a wider set of public service values where they're expected to do both? So that was just something that came up. I wondered if in your digging into the data, there was anything that had really surprised you. And then my final thing was, I thought Julie's comment about the DR saying, well, it just seems to work, was really interesting. And I wondered if you had an opportunity to ask them what it working meant to them, and was it that it got more views, or so was the value sitting behind that word only views? Or was there space for any other public service values in terms of the way they were understanding it seems to work? So yeah, thank you. So apologies for all the questions.
All right. So
well, can I answer first? Because I think it's a short answer. It was purely quantitative. So number of users, it works. We're happy. We get users watching. Yeah.
And I think that's so interesting, isn't it, when we're talking about such value driven organizations that have to report back on those values, but
especially because it goes against some of the strategies where they say it's about the value, the experience, not the numbers. But when it starts going down, then you worry more about the numbers. I guess
it makes me think that we can talk about all of these different values, but legitimacy is probably the driving value from both a regulatory and a broadcaster practice perspective, but is never actually written down, right? It's the implicit value. If people don't watch, you're not going to get your funding, you're going to lose. Yeah. So anyway, really interesting. Thank you.
So yeah, there were two questions in there that you had for me, and I'll try to answer. The first one was about the different approaches. That is what I was doing with the diversity and the universalism. I was taking a very crude approach to it and a very sort of reductive approach. And this is Jannick and I have had debates because he doesn't like this, but that's fine. But it's kind of like the only way I think that we can start to kind of get at and start to think about those things given the data that we currently have. But like I say, if you could sort of bring in more sort of, you know, richer data sets and then combine it with qualitative stuff, then I think you can't say anything for sure just by looking at this. You can't make any kind of, it's, you know, grand statements or claims. I think you would say, here's something that's interesting. Now let's kind of use that to kind of explore it further, essentially. So for me, it's a kind of, these things are just a kind of jumping off point. But it is interesting. There does seem to be a kind of contradiction of approaches. On the one hand, it seems like there is this diversity high up, but overall, there is also a sense of sameness in a lot of spaces of the interface, if that makes sense. And I still haven't kind of got my head around it because I think this is all quite recent. These discoveries and putting this stuff together is quite recent, but it is something we want to look into. In terms of the other question, which was about anything interesting I discovered in this, I think if I'm able to switch back to the Tableau, where is it? This only just kind of came up the other day when I was putting this one together, this dashboard here. Is it my screen still sharing? Yeah. Okay. So this area here, which I've labeled high turnover area, it's really baffling and interesting. I'm not quite sure. I haven't kind of interpreted or tried to understand what this means. What I think it means is that in this area of the interface, so this is the top 0 row, and this is the bottom row, and then these are the columns across, and these are all of the titles that appear within the interface. And here there's this kind of blank area, a sort of diagonal, it's almost like a kind of triangle I think you've got here, which suggests to me that content never spends much time in that space. It just moves somewhere else. But it's too much of a clear pattern for it to be a coincidence. So there's someone's either deliberately made a decision here, or there's something in a piece of algorithm or code or something that is doing that I think is quite interesting. And like I said, I don't know what to make of it or understand why it's happening, but for me, it's an interesting kind of starting point to kind of then explore further. So anyway, I think there's a million more questions coming in the room, and I'm probably doing a terrible job of chairing this, but let me see what else we've had. So Catherine has asked, a different Catherine this is, speaking of tool criticism, in how far have you found working with Tableau limiting? So yeah, that's a really good question. On the one hand, not limiting at all, and that is a problem because you can essentially do anything with it and sort of color things in any way, and there are so many different kinds of, I mean, there are presets and things like that kind of encourage you to sort of design them in certain ways, but it's so expansive that you can almost do anything with it. But then actually at the same time, with the data itself, there are some limitations in terms of how it can sort of interrogate and analyze that data. So for example, with the diversity analysis, which was this one here, to just get this calculation of average genres per row and break it down and present it like this, it's not possible to do that in Tableau. I had to sort of run a different script on it in R, in the programming language, to output a new data set, which I then brought back into Tableau to do this. So it seems visually that you can almost do anything, but actually in terms of the analysis, there are some limitations. So I think I mean, I don't know, hopefully that answers the question, but it does seem that it has some limitations to some extent. Let's see, another question. Assuming you use web scraping to collect the data, how do you define genre? Yeah, so many VOD portals nowadays do not use genres as labels. Instead, they explain the content through the description or emotions. How do you deal with that in the process of collecting the data? That's, again, a really good question. Frustratingly, it seems to change quite frequently. So in my sort of 4+ years of scraping iPlayer, it has changed. It goes through periods where they don't seem to use genre much, and literally about 4 or 5 days ago, they've completely changed and removed all genre information. So now there isn't even genre listed on the main page, which from my point of view, as someone trying to scrape and accumulate that data, has just made it a complete nightmare. But there are sort of like techniques and ways. I sort of hired this very sort of amazing student we had, Python programmer, to write a script that would then go and look up the sort of source of the program and its kind of original program page on BBC, and then scrape all this other data and sort of attach it to all of that. So it is really challenging, and there are constant shifts in how the interfaces are kind of laid out, the kinds of information they sort of display at any one time. And that, again, is just as personalization is going to be a real challenge. I think that sort of flexibility of the interface is another really difficult challenge that we have to deal with. So I realise we're sort of running out of time, and I do sort of want to wrap up soon, but there's a couple of other comments. So yeah, Catherine Johnson says it would be great to take that question of what is diversity and what is universality back to the broadcasters. How do they evaluate these things? I think that's really interesting, and that's where I think Julia comes in. This is where we can then give you those insights and send you off to go and talk with these people, and then come back with some interesting feedback. Or maybe, like you said, they've done in previous interviews, they'll just come back and go, I don't know, it's just what we've been doing and it seems to work. Maybe they don't sort of think about these things very much, and we're finding these patterns. But it'll be interesting to see what they say. Anything else? So you've already replied to that anyway, so you've got another interview, so you can talk to them about that. And it would be interesting if there were definitions that could be tested in the data analysis. Yeah, definitely not that simple. I think that is the sort of big challenge, particularly Jannick and I are wrestling with, is with the notion of how do you sort of convert these things into sort of categories, and how do you use those categories to then sort of measure and do the analysis. So apologies, I've had to rush through all of those. It's 12:59, so I think technically we're probably meant to pull things to a close. But Julia, do you have any final things you wanted to add or say at this stage?
No, I don't want to rush things, but thank you for the very interesting questions and discussion. It has really been enjoyable taking part in this.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Again, same thanks, and thanks obviously to Elkin, conference organisers, for putting this together. If I would just sort of add, if anyone has any interesting data that they're using, send it my way. I'd be interested to see what it is and play around with it too. So I think that could be fun. So thanks very much. Okay. Thanks everyone.